The black and white photograph sits in an evidence file from 1911, just another piece of routine police documentation from over a century ago. But look closer at the victim's face in that image. Look at those eyes. There's something in that stare that reaches across more than 100 years of distance and grabs hold of you in a way that feels impossible to explain. This isn't just an old photograph. This is the beginning of a story that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, revenge, and the secrets people carry to their graves. Rose Blackwell was 23 years old when that photograph was taken. She had moved to Chicago in 1909 with dreams that looked exactly like everyone else's dreams in those days. The city promised jobs, opportunities, and a chance to build something better than the farm life she'd left behind in rural Indiana. For 2 years, those promises seemed real enough. She found work at a textile factory on the south side, shared a cramped apartment with 3 other young women, and saved every spare penny she could scrape together. Her letters home talked about the electric lights, the noise of the streetcars, and the feeling that the whole world was moving forward into a bright new century. Those letters stopped coming in March of 1911. The police report from that month describes the scene in cold, procedural language. Officers responding to a call found Rose in an abandoned warehouse near the river. She had been there for at least 2 days before anyone discovered her. The details of what happened to her are documented with the kind of clinical precision that law enforcement used back then, each injury cataloged and measured as if trauma could be quantified by inches and angles. But the report also notes something else, something the investigating officers couldn't quite put into words. When they found Rose, she was still alive, barely conscious, severely injured, but alive. And when the police photographer arrived to document the scene, Rose's eyes were open. She was looking directly at the camera. That photograph became part of the official evidence file. In 1911, crime scene photography was still a relatively new practice. The technology had only been reliable for a couple of decades, and most police departments were still figuring out how to use it effectively. The usual protocol was to photograph the scene, any weapons or evidence, and sometimes the victims if they were deceased. Photographing a living victim was unusual. The officer who made that decision, a sergeant named Julia Ryder, would later say she couldn't explain why she felt it was necessary. Something about the look on Rose's face demanded to be recorded. Something about those eyes needed to be preserved. Julia Ryder had been with the Chicago Police Department for 6 years, one of only a handful of women in the force at that time. She'd fought for every inch of respect she'd earned, working twice as hard as her male colleagues just to be taken half as seriously. Julia had seen plenty of crime scenes in her career. She'd investigated robberies, assaults, even murders. She thought she'd developed the thick skin necessary to handle whatever the job threw at her. But when she arrived at that warehouse and saw Rose lying there, something shifted inside her. Later, in her personal journal, Julia wrote that looking at Rose felt like staring into a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your future. She couldn't shake the feeling that Rose was trying to communicate something urgent, something that went beyond the immediate horror of what had happened. The investigation into Rose's attack followed the standard procedures of the time. Police interviewed everyone who knew her. They talked to her roommates, her factory supervisors, her neighbors, anyone who might have information about where she'd been or who she'd been with in the days before the attack. They combed through the warehouse looking for clues. They filed their reports and pursued their leads, and they ran into walls at every single turn. Rose's roommates said she'd been acting normally in the weeks before the attack. She went to work, came home, occasionally went to church on Sundays. She didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't go out to dance halls or saloons. She lived a quiet, unremarkable life that gave investigators almost nothing to work with. The factory supervisors confirmed she was a reliable worker who never caused trouble. The neighbors barely knew her name. Everyone described Rose as polite, reserved, and utterly forgettable. She was exactly the kind of person who could disappear without anyone noticing until it was too late. The warehouse where Rose was found belonged to a shipping company that had gone bankrupt the previous year. The building had been sitting empty for months, a fact that made it popular with the city's homeless population and anyone else looking for a place to hide from the law or the cold. Dozens of people could have been in and out of that building in the days before Rose was found. The police had no way to track them all down, and even if they could, most wouldn't talk to law enforcement anyway. The investigation was going nowhere fast. Then Julia Ryder made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She took the photograph of Rose and started showing it around the neighborhood. Not the official evidence photo, but a copy she'd made herself. She went door to door, shop to shop, asking if anyone recognized the woman in the picture. She wasn't following official procedure. She wasn't even sure what she was hoping to accomplish. But something about those eyes in that photograph wouldn't let her rest. She needed answers, even if the department had already started moving on to other cases. 3 weeks after the attack, Julia got her first real lead. A shopkeeper on the west side recognized Rose from the photograph. More than that, he remembered seeing her in his store about a week before the attack. She'd been with a man. The shopkeeper couldn't describe the man in detail. It had been brief, and he hadn't paid much attention, but he remembered Rose because she'd seemed nervous. She kept looking at the man like she was afraid of him, but also like she was trying not to show it. The shopkeeper had assumed it was just a lover's quarrel and hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now, looking at the photograph, he wished he'd paid more attention. Julia pursued this lead with an intensity that worried her colleagues. She started spending her off-duty hours tracking down anyone else who might have seen Rose with this mysterious man. She went back to the warehouse repeatedly, searching for evidence the initial investigation might have missed. She interviewed Rose's roommates again, pressing them harder about whether Rose had mentioned meeting anyone new. And slowly, piece by piece, a pattern started to emerge. Rose had been seeing someone. She'd kept it secret from her roommates, but there were signs if you knew where to look. She'd started coming home later than usual from work. She'd bought a new dress, a small luxury that seemed out of character for someone as frugal as Rose. She'd been writing letters that she didn't mail home to her family. And according to one of her roommates who Julia interviewed for the 3rd time, Rose had seemed scared in the days before she disappeared. Not obviously frightened, but jumpy, distracted, like someone waiting for something bad to happen. The man Rose had been seeing was named Carlos Connor. Julia discovered his identity through a combination of determined detective work and sheer luck. One of Rose's letters, a draft she'd written but never sent, was found tucked inside a book in the apartment. The letter talked about meeting someone who made her feel special, who promised her things would be different, who said he could give her a better life. The letter also mentioned a name, just once, carefully written and then crossed out: Carlos. Carlos Connor was a familiar name to the Chicago police, though not in a good way. He'd been arrested twice for assault, once for robbery, and he was suspected of being involved in several more serious crimes that the police had never been able to prove. He worked as an enforcer for one of the city's smaller criminal operations, the kind of man who got hired when someone needed a problem solved through violence and intimidation. He was 31 years old, had no permanent address, and had a reputation for being charming right up until he wasn't. Julia brought this information to her superiors. She laid out everything she'd found: the witnesses who'd seen Rose with a man matching Carlos's description, the letter that mentioned his name, the timeline that put him in the right place at the right time. She expected them to immediately issue a warrant for his arrest. Instead, she got pushback. The evidence was circumstantial. The witnesses weren't reliable. The letter didn't prove anything. And Carlos Connor had connections, people in the city who wouldn't be happy if the police started causing problems for him without solid proof. Julia was told to drop it and focus on cases that actually had a chance of being solved. She didn't drop it. Julia Ryder had spent her entire career being told what she couldn't do, what she shouldn't try, what wasn't appropriate for a woman in her position. She'd ignored those warnings before, and she ignored them now. If the department wouldn't pursue Carlos Connor officially, she'd do it herself. It was a reckless decision, the kind of choice that could end her career or worse. But every time Julia looked at that photograph of Rose, at those eyes staring directly into the camera, she felt like she had no other option. Finding Carlos wasn't difficult. Men like him didn't hide. They moved through the city openly, protected by their reputations and their connections. Julia started following him, tracking his movements, learning his patterns. She watched him meet with associates in smoky back rooms. She saw him collect money from frightened shopkeepers. She observed him drinking in saloons where decent people didn't go, and she waited for him to make a mistake. The mistake came in early May, about 2 months after Rose's attack. Carlos got into an argument outside a gambling house with another man from a rival operation. The argument turned physical. The other man ended up with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs, and Julia was there, watching from across the street, with 2 uniformed officers she'd convinced to come with her. This time, there were witnesses who couldn't be intimidated. This time, there was an arrest that would stick. This time, Carlos Connor was going to answer for what he'd done. Except Carlos didn't break during interrogation. He sat in that interview room with the kind of calm that comes from knowing the system can't really touch you. He admitted to the assault outside the gambling house that was witnessed by too many people to deny, but he denied everything related to Rose. He'd never met her. He'd never been to that warehouse. He had alibis for the relevant dates, provided by friends who would swear to whatever story he needed them to tell. And his lawyer, a well-dressed man with political connections, made it clear that any attempt to connect Carlos to Rose's case would be met with legal challenges that the department didn't have the resources to fight. Julia played her last card. She brought the photograph into the interrogation room and placed it on the table in front of Carlos. She didn't say anything at first. She just let him look at it, let him see Rose's face, those eyes staring out from the image with an intensity that seemed to fill the room. And for just a moment, Julia saw something flicker across Carlos's expression. Not guilt, exactly, not remorse, but recognition, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of fear. Carlos looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up at Julia and smiled. It was the kind of smile that told her she'd been right about everything, but that it wouldn't matter. He pushed the photograph back across the table and said 3 words that Julia would remember for the rest of her life. Prove it happened. The trial, when it finally happened, wasn't for what Carlos did to Rose. The evidence wasn't there, or at least not in a form that would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, Carlos was tried for the assault outside the gambling house and for several other charges the police had managed to make stick. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was something. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a fraction of what he deserved, but more than Julia had dared to hope for. And throughout the trial, that photograph of Rose sat in the evidence file, those eyes watching everything unfold from behind glass and paper. Rose herself never testified. She couldn't. The injuries she'd sustained in that warehouse had been too severe. She'd survived the initial attack, defied the odds that said she should have died in that abandoned building, but the damage was permanent. Rose spent the rest of her short life in a charity hospital, never fully regaining consciousness, never able to tell anyone what had really happened. She died in November of 1911, 8 months after the attack, and was buried in a pauper's grave with no marker and no ceremony. The newspapers, if they mentioned her death at all, gave it a single line in the back pages. Just another tragedy in a city full of tragedies. But Julia never forgot. She kept a copy of that photograph in her desk drawer for the next 30 years of her career. She looked at it whenever a case seemed impossible, whenever the system seemed designed to protect the guilty instead of the innocent, whenever she felt like giving up. Those eyes reminded her why she'd become a police officer in the first place. They reminded her that every victim deserved someone to fight for them, even when that fight seemed hopeless, and they reminded her that some wounds never heal, some injustices never get resolved, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. The story might have ended there, just another unsolved case from Chicago's violent past, except for what happened to Carlos Connor in prison. He served 3 years of his 5-year sentence before being released early for good behavior. He walked out of that prison in 1914, supposedly a reformed man, ready to start fresh. He lasted 6 weeks on the outside before someone killed him. The murder happened in an alley not far from the warehouse where Rose had been found. Carlos was stabbed multiple times and left to bleed out in the dark. The police investigation into his death was perfunctory at best. A known criminal with countless enemies gets killed in a bad part of town. That kind of thing happened all the time. Nobody was particularly motivated to solve it. Nobody except Julia Ryder, who heard about the murder and felt that old familiar pull of curiosity and dread. She went to see the body at the morgue. She wasn't officially assigned to the case, but the officers who were didn't object to her presence. They knew her reputation by then, knew better than to get in her way when she was pursuing something. Julia looked down at Carlos's corpse and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sense of justice served. Just an empty certainty that one bad thing had been replaced by another bad thing, and the world kept turning regardless. Then she noticed something strange. Carlos's eyes were open. They'd presumably opened after death, a common enough occurrence that usually got corrected before the body was photographed for the records. But in this case, the police photographer had already done his work. The image had been captured with Carlos's dead eyes staring straight at the camera, empty and glazed, but somehow still present. And when Julia saw that photograph later, when she looked at those dead eyes in that official evidence file, she felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. The photographs looked similar. Not identical. The circumstances were completely different. But there was something in the composition, something in the way the eyes dominated the image that made Julia think of Rose. It was like the two pictures were having a conversation across time and death, asking questions that couldn't be answered by any investigation or trial. She tried to shake off the feeling. She told herself it was just pattern recognition, the human brain's tendency to find meaning in coincidence. But she couldn't quite make herself believe it. The investigation into Carlos's death went nowhere. There were no witnesses. There was no evidence beyond the body itself. The murder weapon was never found. Dozens of people might have wanted Carlos dead, and any one of them could have been in that alley that night. The case was filed away as unsolved, another ghost to haunt the precinct's basement archives. And Julia, despite every instinct telling her to dig deeper, let it go. Some mysteries, she decided, were meant to stay mysteries. Years passed. Julia continued her career, eventually becoming one of the first female detectives in the Chicago Police Department. She worked hundreds of cases, solved more than her share, and earned the respect that had been denied to her for so long. She married another police officer, had 2 children, lived a life that looked normal from the outside. But she never threw away that photograph of Rose. It moved with her from desk to desk, office to office, a constant reminder of the case that had defined her understanding of what justice meant and how rarely it was truly achieved. In 1935, Julia retired from the police force. She was 53 years old and tired in ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She'd seen too much, fought too many battles, carried too many unsolved cases in her memory. But before she left, she did something that surprised her colleagues. She requested permission to access the old evidence files from 1911, specifically the Rose Blackwell case. Nobody objected. Most of the officers working in 1935 hadn't even been born when Rose was attacked. The case meant nothing to them. They let Julia take the original photograph from the file, officially logging it as destroyed, and nobody questioned her motives. Julia took that photograph home. She framed it and hung it in her study, much to her family's confusion and concern. Her husband asked why she wanted to look at such a disturbing image every day. Her children found it creepy and avoided the room, but Julia felt like she owed Rose something. The woman had been forgotten by everyone except the officer who'd fought for her, and now that officer was retiring. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to keep bearing witness. The photograph hung in that study for 23 years. Julia looked at it every morning and every evening. She grew old, staring into those eyes that never aged, never changed, never stopped asking their silent questions. And in all that time, she never told anyone the full story. Not her husband, not her children, not the memoir she was occasionally asked to write about her groundbreaking career. Some stories, she believed, weren't meant to be told in neat narratives with clear beginnings and satisfying endings. Some stories were meant to be carried quietly, like scars that ache when the weather changes. Julia died in 1958 at the age of 76. Her children, now middle-aged themselves, had to sort through her belongings. They found the photograph in the study, still hanging in its frame after all those years. Neither of them knew who the woman in the image was. Their mother had never explained. They briefly considered throwing it away. It was just an old police photograph after all, but something stopped them. Maybe it was the eyes. Maybe it was the feeling that this image had been important to their mother for reasons they didn't understand but should respect. They donated it instead, along with boxes of Julia's other papers and effects, to the Chicago History Museum. The photograph sat in the museum's archives for decades. Occasionally, a researcher would come across it while looking through Julia Ryder's papers. Some found it disturbing. Others thought it was a powerful example of early crime scene photography. A few tried to research the story behind it, but the trail had gone cold. The police records from that era were incomplete or destroyed. The newspapers had barely covered Rose's case. The people who'd been involved were all dead. The photograph became just another artifact, interesting to specialists but unknown to the general public. Then came the Internet. Suddenly, old archives were being digitized and made available online. Historical photographs that had been locked away in storage for generations were now accessible to anyone with a computer and curiosity. In 2003, as part of a larger digitization project, the Chicago History Museum scanned the photograph of Rose Blackwell and uploaded it to their online database. They included what little information they had: the date, the photographer's name, and a brief note that it was connected to an unsolved assault case from 1911. The photograph went viral, though that term didn't really exist yet in 2003. It started on forums dedicated to true crime and historical mysteries. Someone would post the image. Others would comment on how haunting it was, how the victim's eyes seemed to follow you no matter what angle you looked from, how there was something deeply unsettling about the intensity of that gaze. The story would get shared, then shared again, each iteration adding new speculation and theories. Who was she? What happened to her? Was the case ever solved? Why did her eyes look like that? Most of the theories were wrong. People guessed she'd been murdered, that she'd been involved with organized crime, that she'd been a prostitute or a gangster's moll, or any number of other dramatic but inaccurate scenarios. The truth, that she'd been an ordinary young woman who'd made the mistake of trusting the wrong person, was less exciting than the fiction people invented. But the photograph itself remained powerful regardless of the stories attached to it. Those eyes transcended the need for accurate context. They communicated something fundamental about suffering and survival that didn't require you to know the details. In the years since, the photograph has appeared in countless articles, videos, and discussions about unsettling historical images. It shows up in listicles with titles like 10 Vintage Photos That Will Keep You Up at Night and The Most Disturbing Crime Scene Photos Ever Taken. It's been analyzed by photographers who marvel at the technical skill required to capture such a powerful image with the primitive equipment available in 1911. It's been discussed by true crime enthusiasts who've tried, and largely failed, to piece together what really happened. And through it all, Rose's eyes keep staring out from that century-old photograph, refusing to be forgotten, refusing to let viewers look away. There's something about those eyes that defies easy explanation. Photographers talk about how the lighting and composition create a sense of direct confrontation between the subject and the viewer. Psychologists discuss how humans are wired to find faces, especially eyes, compelling, and how this photograph exploits that instinct. Artists analyze it as an early example of documentary photography that transcends documentation to become something more profound. But none of these explanations quite capture why the image feels so personal, so immediate, so impossible to dismiss as just an old piece of evidence from a forgotten case. Maybe it's because Rose was still alive when the photograph was taken. She wasn't a corpse, wasn't just evidence of a crime, but a person actively experiencing trauma and still fighting to survive. Her eyes aren't the empty gaze of death. They're the determined stare of someone who refused to disappear quietly, who insisted on being seen even in her most vulnerable moment. That distinction matters. It transforms the photograph from a historical curiosity into a confrontation with mortality and resilience that feels relevant regardless of when you're viewing it. Or maybe it's because the photograph represents everything we fear about injustice and impermanence. Rose was attacked, nearly killed, and then forgotten by almost everyone. Her attacker faced only token punishment for other crimes. The system that was supposed to protect her failed at every level. And yet the photograph survived, carrying her story forward when everything else about her life was lost. It's a reminder that individual lives matter even when institutions treat them as disposable, that bearing witness has value even when justice remains elusive, that some things deserve to be remembered even when forgetting would be easier. The photograph continues to circulate online. New generations discover it and react with the same mixture of fascination and discomfort that previous viewers felt. People share it, discuss it, theorize about it. Some create art inspired by it. Others use it as an example in discussions about ethics in documentary photography. A few even make pilgrimages to Chicago, trying to find the warehouse where Rose was discovered, though that building was demolished decades ago and replaced by developments that bear no trace of what happened there in 1911. Rose Blackwell, if she could somehow know that her image would outlive her by more than a century, might be horrified or comforted or both. She never asked to become a symbol. She just wanted to survive, to build a life, to matter to someone. The photograph grants her a kind of immortality. But it's an immortality defined by her worst moment, her greatest suffering. Is that a gift or a curse? The question has no easy answer. What's certain is that the photograph has given Rose something that the legal system and society of her time denied her: the refusal to be forgotten, the insistence that her story matters, the power to make people in the future stop and recognize her humanity. Julia Ryder, in her later years, wrote in her journal about why she'd kept that photograph for so long. She said it reminded her of everyone she hadn't been able to help, all the cases that got away, all the victims who deserved justice but got only bureaucracy and indifference. But she also said it reminded her why the work mattered anyway. Even when you couldn't solve the case, even when the system failed, even when the bad guys won, the act of bearing witness had value. The act of refusing to look away, of insisting that someone's suffering should be acknowledged, of documenting the truth even when it was painful. That, Julia believed, was the real purpose of the photograph. Not to solve Rose's case, but to ensure she was never completely erased. Today, more than 100 years after it was taken, the photograph still serves that purpose. It still makes people stop and look. It still generates discussions about crime, justice, photography, and memory. It still refuses to be just another piece of historical data. And those eyes, Rose's eyes, still seem to look directly at whoever is viewing the image, creating a connection that shouldn't be possible across so much time and distance, but somehow undeniably is. The story of Rose Blackwell and the photograph that preserved her will never have a satisfying conclusion. Too much time has passed, too many records have been lost, too many people who knew the truth have died. We'll never know exactly what Carlos Connor did that day in the warehouse. We'll never hear Rose's own account of what happened. We'll never achieve the kind of justice that would feel adequate for what she endured. But we have the photograph. We have Julia's determination to remember. We have the ongoing conversation that the image provokes. And maybe that's its own form of justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real nonetheless. If you take anything away from this story, let it be this. The photograph that seemed routine in 1911 has become something far more significant over time. Not because the image itself changed, but because each generation that encounters it brings new understanding and new questions. Rose's eyes still chill us today because they challenge us to think about how we treat the vulnerable, how we define justice, how we remember or forget the people who suffer in obscurity. That challenge is uncomfortable. It's meant to be. The best historical documents don't let us feel safe in our distance from the past. They remind us that the past was full of real people with real pain, and that how we respond to their stories says something important about who we are now. Consider sharing this story, not because it has a happy ending, but because Rose Blackwell deserves to be remembered as more than just a pair of eyes in a disturbing photograph. She deserves to be recognized as a person who lived, who suffered, who survived longer than anyone expected, and who left behind an image that refuses to release its grip on our collective conscience.